What's up, friends? Today I had the pleasure of interviewing the one and only Nina Teicholz. She's a PhD, investigative journalist, and the author of The Big Fat Surprise, one of my personal favorite health books of all time. Got me started on this crazy journey of health. And we have a conversation all about the history of seed oils, how they became so pervasive to this very day. Because Nina understands the history of all of this better than arguably anybody on earth. And we talk about the craziest things that happened to her during her 9 years of research creating the Big Fat Surprise, the attacks from the mafia, that is the margarine-based crowd, the seed oil defenders, how damaging it was to switch out saturated fat, and the low-fat craze that was born in the wake of Ansel Keys. We talk about whether she'll be joining Bobby Kennedy and reforming the dietary guidelines to make America healthy again, and so much more. It's always a joy and a pleasure talking to Nina. She was one of the stars in the Fed Alive documentary, which is on Heart and Soul's YouTube right now. Go check it out after this podcast. Nina Teicholz. Let's go. Nina, we recently had the pleasure of sitting pretty close together on stage for the Fed Alive movie premiere, where we were trying to gather the Avengers and take down big seed oil, and you are one of the big hitters in this space. And that was only a few weeks ago, yet a lot happens in this space very quickly. I know recently you've been battling with the new scientific advisory on the dietary guidelines and all that stuff. So I want to get into a lot of things with you today. But what I'm particularly excited about is that you understand the history maybe better than anybody else in the world, like the food corruption, the introduction of seed oils and all of it. So before we get into some of the mechanistic stuff maybe and the harms and what it's doing, like I would love for you to set the scene and tell me a little bit about how you got into this investigative journalist kind of role and what you learned about the corruption in our food industry.
Well, first, thank you for having me on the show, and I'm delighted to be here. And the way I got started on seed oils, I don't know if most people know this story, but I actually was first going to write a book on trans fats. My breakthrough article in 1989 had been in Gourmet magazine on trans fats, in which I discovered that that the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oil, which is the trade association for vegetable oils, had engaged in what I thought were unbelievable tactics to try to suppress the science that was coming out at that point about trans fats. But those tactics have persevered and are now being used to try to suppress the science of what we're discovering about linoleic and linolenic acids and being problems of oxidation. But back then, I talked to somebody who had been hired to go to conferences and basically heckle and intimidate any scientist who had raised issues about potential problems of trans fats being in vegetable oils. For those people who don't remember trans fats because they're being issued out of the food supply now and have been for some years now, those are the fatty acids that are formed when the oils are hardened through a process called hydrogenation to make margarine or Crisco, for instance. It's one of the many byproducts is trans fats, and so we've reversed out of using them in our food supplies largely. So these were members of the Institute in Shortening and Edible Oils who would heckle scientists at conferences who challenged their products. I talked to a woman named Mary Enig, who was an early researcher on trans fats at the University of Maryland. She had people from the margarine industry come visit her office and say, we've been watching this issue closely. We don't know how this horse got out of the barn when she published her results. Her editor at a journal where she had submitted a paper, Mildred Seelig, I believe is her name, she got visited by the margarine industry reps trying to get that paper pulled from a journal. There were tactics of Mary Enig was called all kinds of names, smeared, slandered. There were other scientists. One was named Randall Wood from a university in Texas. He was so attacked. His papers were so rigorously attacked that he eventually just got out of the field. He said it would make you paranoid. You would go to publish something, and no matter how many times you checked your facts, they would go through the paper with a fine-tooth comb and find something that was wrong. And it made him so paranoid, he just got out of the field, and when I talked to him, he was ranching because he just gave up academia altogether. Okay, that really opened my mind to this whole field of vegetable, now we call seed oils. I joined the Oil Chemist Society for 2 years, which is the group of the scientists who deal with these vegetable oils. They do the science on them. It's all industry people. I did that to get to their papers, to read their magazines, to understand, to go to their conferences and talk to them. I really got on the deep inside world of seed oils. And that's where I started to discover that there was just this huge story. There was the trans fat story, but then there was a continuing story of how did these things get into our food supply? That's when I went back and traced their origin through that had been documented by others, but that we had this excess supply of cotton seeds in the South where they were growing cotton in the United States. They had nothing to do with those seeds. They learned to press them into oil. That oil then was used as lubricant for machinery in the Industrial Revolution. Oil was greatly needed because we had hunted out all the whales, which were largely hunted for their oil. So Americans and others turned to cottonseed oil. And then that was slowly, some of that cottonseed oil was sneakily kind of inserted into butter. And so there was adulterated butter being sold in the late 1800s. But the big bang, as everybody now knows, of these seed oils coming into the U.S. food supply was 1911 with the introduction of Crisco oil, introduced by Procter and Gamble. They had made this kind of, a kind of sludge, a gray sludge, but they deodorized it, winterized it, bleached it. And they thought, oh, this looks kind of like lard. Why don't we try to sell it as a foodstuff? And I think it's interesting how Americans adopted this with so much energy. There was an enormous marketing campaign that Procter and Gamble undertook. They had books on, how to cook with Crisco. Every recipe was, use Crisco instead of lard. They made an appeal to American housewives that this was like giving up the old spinning wheel of your grandmother. This new fat came from clean stainless steel countertops in laboratories and not the dirty abattoirs of the slaughterhouse. Remember, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair had come out recently, and there had been sort of a revulsion that people felt towards the slaughterhouses. And so here was this new and modern foodstuff that housewives could turn to, and American housewives, uniquely in a country of immigrants, it's different than in England where you are or other countries. They really, at that point, wanted to assimilate. So leaving behind the practices of their grandmothers, adopting new practices from women's magazines or from whatever sources that came to them, TV, they were eager to do that. So there was a huge shift over to using Crisco oil. It was also the hard stuff. It was also always cheaper than butter. And after that came margarine, also cheaper than butter. There's a huge, actually, I wrote like 15,000 words on the margarine wars that existed, that never got published, that existed in the US, where every state had these wars going on because the dairy industry was trying to protect the butter. American housewives were trying to get margarine, which was cheaper. Margarine had this patchwork of crazy laws, like it could only be sold in white blocks, and then the housewife would had to like knead the color into the margarine, or it had to be sold as pink, anything to keep it from resembling butter. That was finally all those regulations were eradicated, and I think it was 1949. Then in the 40s also came the oils, just the standalone oils on the shelf. And remember, always the problem with these seed oils is that their fatty acids contain a lot of double bonds. Double bonds, if you think of like a double bond between two atoms, those double bonds can open up especially under conditions of heat and light, and attach to oxygen molecules. That's called oxidation, and that is what makes these fatty acids extremely unstable. And that leads to them going rancid. It leads to them having, off smells. It also leads to other kinds of what we call perioxidation products, but a whole line of products that are oxidation products and beyond. But basically, the process that had allowed the stabilization of those oils was always and continues to be a key challenge for the industry. Stabilizing them, hardening them through hydrogenation for Crisco allowed them to be stable. And I won't go into all those details, the chemical details, but it was harder to get the oils stable because those molecules were still had a lot of double bonds in them. They didn't get rid of the double bonds. So they figured out how to do something called a very light hydrogenation in order to market these oils on shelves. And then there was a whole marketing campaign, frying them, do your fried chicken, whatever, use them in the kitchen, use them for whatever purposes. So they just soared into the food supply. And then there were other events as time went on to even further push them into the food supply. But maybe that's a good foundation to start with.
It's fascinating to me to hear you recount the stories of the stories that you heard about the hecklers come into debates or lectures or whatever it was. When you were saying it, I'm almost want to call them the margarine mafia. That's literally what they sound like a bunch of hooligans trying to silence this, because obviously I think that comes down to injuring the bottom line and profits at the end of the day, right? So you have a New York Times bestselling book called The Big Fat Surprise. Obviously, this story is central to that book, which then brought you into this whole other world of, what's maybe saturated fat isn't this, terrible thing we've been led to believe all along. How did this research all morph into the book, and where did you start putting the pieces together in terms of how it all played out with the low fat movement? I know you've done deep dives on Ansel Keys and all of that stuff. Tell me a little bit about your journey with writing the book and what you learned, what surprised you the most.
It was completely circuitous and surprising to me. I mean, let's just remember, I started off as a vegetarian who did not eat meat, red meat or butter. And then I did this art. I was assigned to do this article on trans fats. That became it was one of the most highly read articles in the magazine at that time. That's what led to a book contract on trans fats. I was supposed to write a book on trans fats. Then when I started diving into the whole subject, I realized there was a much bigger story here about how we had seemingly got it wrong on all fats, good fats, bad fats, low fat, how much fat to eat. I mean, those have been at the heart of our nutrition recommendations, and we have obsessed about fats the most, really, for generations, the non-fat diet. So I started to look into all fats, and then I thought my book would be, a tour through various fats. I had a whole long chapter on fish oils and omega-3s. That got cut. And then I included a chapter on the Mediterranean diet, looking at olive oil. And then my editor, when she finally really took it in hand, she said, your book is about the fact that we wrongly vilified saturated fats. She said, that is the central focus of your book, which I hadn't. And then she said, well, and what replaced them, which is these seed oils, which I had also done a lot of work on. So she said, focus your book on that. And that's what I did. And then I reordered. This all took me 9 years, you understand. I read thousands and thousands of scientific papers. As I've already described, 2 pieces of writing that I jettisoned and never made it into the book. I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of scientists and industry experts all over the world. So it really took a long time to bring this all to fruition. But I think ultimately the contributions of the book it really was the first description of all the arguments and the history, making the case that we had gotten it wrong on saturated fats. it was the first to either present the evidence or popularize evidence showing that seed oils had been a bad alternative and had serious health concerns associated with them. And I think it's really tells the history of how we got where we are. Like, what is the incredible history of how we got our dietary guidelines? Who are the characters involved? There's a lot of people involved in the book. And then, as a little aside, it is, I think, the only real rigorous critique of the Mediterranean diet that exists, which is a kind of fun standalone chapter about how that whole effort was funded by the European Olive Oil Council and
Mhm.
really is not a properly defined diet and never has been. So it was a windy, twisty road. I had more than one publisher. I got booted by one publisher and had to find another publisher. I mean, it was by no means a sure thing. But yeah, in the end, I felt really happy about how it came out and the publisher and the editor that I had. I was very lucky.
Yes, it was. It really was. And I told you this when we met in person after I can't even remember how many years ago it was that I read that book, but it was really on my health awakening, if you will. It was the seminal book that I consumed that I couldn't put it down. It was like reading an exciting fantasy novel, but it was the history, like you said, just put together. I was reading it, I was like, what? What is going on here? Because once you kind of open Pandora's box in that way and you're like, wait, they've contorted all of this, they've lied about all of this, like what else? Your whole worldview kind of crumbles in a way. And it was exciting. It was a bit devastating, but I actually felt empowered. I had something tangible I could sink my health teeth into. I was never a particularly healthy person growing up until I found this stuff in my early 20s, and that changed my health trajectory and now influences what I do. So this was massively influential on me. And that is what I was really curious about, hearing back in the day the margarine mafia kind of coming after people and you being in this process for so long. How much have you encountered of that from the scientific community or elsewhere, whether it's just character assassinations from big press? Like, do you still reach and receive a lot of that? Because I imagine you're going up against a pretty big giant here. How have you just stood the test of time? And what's maybe something kind of crazy that's happened to you on that journey?
So it was super interesting to have spent all this time writing about the bullying and smear tactics in nutrition science in my book. So many examples of that, right? So many examples of, and just like the example of Ansel Keys going after John Yudkin, the Imperial College scientist who suggested that it was sugar, not fat, that caused heart disease, and the complete campaign to decimate the career of John Yudkin successfully, right? That
Mm-hmm.
story, and maybe I could tell you 10 others that I wrote about at least. Um, but then I have to say, I was unprepared for, I knew it was coming, but I was still unprepared for the attacks that would be unleashed on me, which started before my book was even published. There was a columnist, a Yale professor, not really a Yale professor, but he called himself that, who wrote a column in the Washington Post attacking my book. And then he wrote 10 more columns calling me a wingnut who must live in her mother's basement, I can't remember all the names he called me. He completely smeared me. He accused me of being connected to the meat industry, which is a classic tactic that Ansel Keys also used against John Yudkin. Accused him of being backed by his financial, whatever, influenced by his financial backers. That's an age old technique.
Yeah.
So this Yale guy, David Katz, went after me for quite a while. We had to send a letter to his editor to say that this is probably libel and that he really needed to
Mm.
be pulled in check. After which he wrote all his columns attacking me, but he not by name, but he would call me Miss Butter, Meat, and Cheese, which is the subtitle of my book, The Big Fat Surprise Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belongs in a Healthy Diet. And he's like, those who would advocate for butter, meat, and cheese, that was always the way of referring to me. He actually got his comeuppance a bit when he had so attacked me, including in an article in The Guardian where he accused me of being an animal unlike he's ever seen, quote.
Wow.
Yale doctors protested, wrote a letter. to the Yale Daily News covered it. And that not too long after that, he retired from his Yale center, which had never really been at Yale. It had been in a nearby hospital, and there was only a tenuous connection to Yale at all. But he retired from that center and has never returned to academia at all. So I don't know if that, I don't know what triggered that, but certainly he got a lot of negative attention in the Yale Daily News for his attacks on me after years of this. So there was that. But I would say maybe, and I had many attacks on me from places, some of the groups that really work to preserve the status quo. I mean, that would be Center for Science in the Public Interest in Washington, D.C. They ran some negative articles on me. The press was constantly accusing me of being connected to the meat industry, even though they could find no evidence of it because it doesn't exist. Maybe the worst thing that happened was that I wrote in 2015. So let me just give a little history here. I had, right after my book came out, and I had read all these studies, all the clinical trials, that support or don't support our dietary guidelines. That year, the US dietary guidelines were coming out. They come out every 5 years, and 2015 happened to be one of those years. And I started focusing on the guidelines, and I read their expert report, which is 380 pages. And of all the really bad science that I had read over the years, I thought this is perhaps the worst science I've ever read, because it's so full of contradictions and inexplicable things, but also because it does not. I went through all the clinical trials that they were using to support their evidence or their claims. The claims that this diet can prevent obesity, diabetes, heart disease. They were misquoting trials. The trials did not support their claims, and they had ignored all of the major clinical trials on the low-fat diet, on the idea that we should cap saturated fats. They had ignored all those trials. Those trials had failed to support those dietary recommendations, and all those trials had been ignored. So with the support of the foundation, I wrote up those findings. I sent them off to the British Medical Journal, which is a pretty well-known journal. The editor-in-chief, Fiona Godley, said, "I love it. Let's do 2 articles on this. And we'd like to run this." We were both just so ridiculously naive at the time. We run one story, which is a cover story for the BMJ. And that becomes the subject of the biggest ever retraction effort in modern history, I think. I mean, I looked and have not found any other retraction effort that is this size. It was about 170 people signing a letter saying that my paper should be retracted, led by this same group, Center for Science in the Public Interest. And they detected what they thought were a bunch of errors. It was really a saga. They couldn't find anybody. They had to go through a process of evaluating these claims. It took a year. They couldn't find anybody who wanted to step up and be part of the process. They finally found one person who works for the US government and the exact agency that issues the guidelines, which is a huge conflict of interest. This is his agency. But in the end, to their credit, they stood up for the paper. They did not retract it. Fiona Godley, editor-in-chief, wrote us a very strong editorial saying, "This is an important paper. Obesity and diabetes are a problem, and we have to, whatever findings come up, as inconvenient as they might be, we need to give them a public airing." So that was a truly awful experience. I mean, for an entire year, I would wake up in the morning and the first thing I would think would be to look at my phone and see what nasty article had been published on me. I mean, the whole science press turned against me, as if I just had nobody really defending me or in my corner at all. And I couldn't look at the word. I have a really good friend from Scotland named Fiona, and I couldn't look at the name Fiona in my inbox without having heart palpitations. And in the end, it it came out well. I mean, they forced a few corrections. They tried to force more, but I hired a lawyer and did my very best to defend the truth. But their goal was to try to get as many corrections or clarifications as possible so they could say, well, Nina's work is riddled with problems. But in the very same way that trans fat researcher had said, they would comb through my papers and find tiny little inconsistencies and make and just attack me to death. That is exactly what was happening with this paper. And none of its major allegations, none of the key allegations, the top line allegations, were overturned or changed as a result of this incredible inspection of every single sentence and assertion. So, and the people signing that retraction letter, they were from Harvard and Yale and all these established institutions that have largely been invested in defending the status quo guidelines. The Guardian reporter, there's a great article by The Guardian by a guy named Ian Leslie, who called up a lot of the people who had signed the letter, and he couldn't find anybody who knew why they had signed the letter. He said, just name one error. Just name one error, and nobody could recall any error with the piece. So it was just a kind of collegial group, sign on for the cause, that nobody, it didn't seem like anybody understood what they were signing on to. Anyway, that was pretty awful. And, I think that these kind of smear tactics I actually believe that nutrition science, people say that, oh, it got so bad in nutrition because the tobacco companies bought the nutrition companies. But I actually think it's the other way around. Nutrition scientists, the big UPF, the early UPF, ultra processed food companies like Standard Biscuits, Heinz, they formed in 1940 an organization to try. Its goal was to influence nutrition science, which is to get science at its start, fund it, influence the scientists. And they have been employing these let's call them cancel tactics.
Right.
They're the original cancel culture in nutrition science. The problems with tobacco, the tobacco industry in their playbook, didn't come along until much later. So I think the direction of causation may be very much that food companies figured out this first. They figured out how to cancel people successfully. They figured out the playbook of smearing people and other kinds of the culture of consensus, or the creating so much confusion in the scientific press that people don't understand. There's always a counter study that will create confusion, so you can't get any kind of clear hold on what something might say. I mean, I have stories of that going back to the 1930s. I think the food industry was the original. They invented cancel culture in science. It's something I'm interested in writing about, because I think what you see is that only came along in tobacco in when the 70s or 80s. By then, the food industry already had a 30-year head start on them.
That's so fascinating. What an interesting reframe to go back that long and understand that something that feels relatively new has been being done in many different ways, just probably more amplified now because of social media attacks, but it's been a long-term playbook. It's this culture of conformity or consensus that you speak to. What do you think that is? Because you've been on the inside, right? You're a scientist, you're an academic, you have a PhD. It seems that some people break away from it. Some people are able to break free, and other people just kind of like herd mentality. Is it this manipulation, and is that driven by companies getting in ears, and is it profit driven? Is it something else? Like, you've probably done a lot of thinking about this. What do you think creates that obsession with controlling the narrative and keeping this, keeping it the same, the fear of change? What is that?
I would say there are many, many causes that drive a culture of complacency or defense of the status quo in science. Mm-hmm. One of them is just simple, and most charitably, is just simply cognitive dissonance. People don't want to change their minds. They especially don't want to change their minds if they spent the last 30 years of their lives trying to prove or working on a certain issue. They're not going to be especially open to overturning their life's work, right? So I think that is a major part of what you see in science. There's also built into the scientific, the world of academic science is the culture of preservation of ideas. So that, let's say I'm Walter Willett at Harvard, very influential scientist. Who do I choose as my proteges and the people who I'm going to sponsor? Who do I get invited to meetings? Who do I assure gets research funds? Who do I assure gets publications in journals? Those are the people who think like me. And I sort of hand the baton off to them. And the people who are challengers quickly discover how unrewarding that career choice is. They don't get invited to conferences, don't get research funding, don't get papers, colleagues don't want to work with them. You are a pariah in your field. And I document quite a few cases in my book of people who, who are at the top of their field and therefore more in a better position to make challenges. A guy like George Mann, who was one of the leaders of the Framingham study, a huge, important government study run by National Institutes of Health. But he was, as he told me, pulled into the hall when he was greatly opposed to the Ansel Keys and the idea that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol cause heart disease. Because one of the famous things that Dr. Mann had done was to go to Kenya and document the lifestyles of the Maasai warriors and discovered they're eating, 60, 70% of their diet was animal fat and they were in spectacular health, right? But he one day at NIH headquarters was called into the hall by a secretary who said, if you're going to continue your opposition to Ansel Keys, you will lose your research grant. And Dr. Mann, who was fierce and principled, did not stop his opposition and did indeed lose his research grant. And his volume of Framingham, which is the one volume on nutrition, where it found that saturated fats did not, in fact, have any link to heart disease. That is the one volume in, I forget how many, maybe 26 volumes, whatever, however many volumes there were in the Framingham report. His volume was the only one to go unpublished and sit in an NIH basement.
Wow.
So it's very clear to people in the field of science that being a challenger is deeply unrewarding. And usually it means the end of your career and your inability to do science. So there's a self-perpetuating mechanism that happens in science, not just nutrition science. I'm sure this happens elsewhere. And it's also why this theory of change that we sometimes hear about from Thomas Kuhn, that we need a generation of scientists to die out, and then the new group will come in with new ideas and we'll be able to change a paradigm, I think is almost entirely untrue. I mean, what we saw in nutrition science is Ansel Keys, the original saturated fat is bad for you guy, literally handing the baton to Walter Willett, who then carried it along with him for the next 50 years. And then Walter Willett is handing it off to Frank Hu or handing it off to like any number of other people. Those ideas continue and they're reinforced by the whole system that produces scientific work. I think another factor undeniably is the influence of the food companies. We talked about how they started that in 1940. Add to that the pharmaceutical companies whose profits come from chronic disease, long time disability, people being on 4 to 5 medications every single day for years and years and years and years, as the average American is. That is a profit model for them. And when I started off researching in nutrition, I truly could not understand why so many nutrition scientists were funded by pharmaceutical companies. I just thought, why is pharma in here? Like, so naively. And I realized that's because they are, I don't think they're paying them off, but they're saying, instead of looking at diet, look over here. Let's look at these. Let's look at this formula-based weight loss company. Like, in the 2020 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, that's the expert committee that makes the guidelines, the guy who was the medical director of OptiFast, currently employed as the medical director of OptiFast, was working on that committee. If he's invested in a formula-based solution, how is he going to take really a serious interest in diet? So their financial interests, the traditional ones that we've known. They're the new financial interests that come from all these fake food companies, fake meat, fake fish, fake eggs, fake mayonnaise. Then you have the animal rights groups, which are very, very well funded in the U.S., and they have all kinds of tactics to try to. They're very focused on reducing meat in the guidelines and keeping the cap on saturated fats because that is the rate limiting factor for keeping red meat or animal foods under control. They have a group called the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine that sort of masquerades as a bunch of doctors, but is in fact mostly non-doctors, animal rights advocates. They've been very, very, very aggressive advocates in this field, like a lot of really, I would call, nasty tactics. And then there's, to add to that, over the last 10 years, the climate change imperative and the idea that the best thing we can do for the planet is to reduce cows, which I think we don't have to go through all the problems in that, but I think there's many holes to be poked into that series of argumentation. But at the heart of that argument is, let's just say cows are a contributor to climate change. We need to figure out how to make livestock more sustainable, because we can't say what we want is a healthy planet where everybody on it has obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and we have to figure out a better way to balance our carbon emissions, save the planet, and also save ourselves. I mean, rather than giving us all chronic diseases, why don't we take fewer airplane flights, or give people a choice? Would you like to not pave your driveway this year and eat meat? That's your choice. You not want to go to Thailand and eat meat? That's also your choice. But forcing everybody, whether through sort of influential campaigns or literally forcing them through, say, vegan Fridays at schools and meatless Mondays at schools, is not giving people the choice to be healthy and balance their carbon in other ways.
Right.
So to me, that's kind of just a bottom line health justice issue, really. We should be allowed to decide that we want good health. I do not want to give up my good health to the planet. I'm happy to drive less, travel less, do other things that can be my contribution.
Right. And when you know the kinds of things that maybe we understand a little more than the layperson, the importance of proper regenerative agriculture and obviously the impacts of health. And okay, let's say you wave a magic wand and you get rid of cows, and then you replace them with row crops as far as the eye can see, and the chemical inputs and the fertilizers and the glyphosate, and everybody's eating Beyond Burgers. Like that house of cards starts to crumble quite quickly. Like currently you referenced, I'm in the UK for the holidays. Now you've heard of probably the Arla scandal, which is a new thing engineered where they feed the cows something, they put it in their feed, it alters methane production in the gut so they burp and fart less. So this is another crazy solution. Instead of actually just fixing at a root cause, the inputs, it's always these new techie scientific ways. And I guess you know this better than anybody, but the more we've gone down that route, it seems the further we've strayed from health. And really what we need to do is make empowered choices, probably over the one thing that all of us agree we should have the most control over, which is our health, instead of having that decided for us by this, like you said, very well coordinated, very well organized and put together group of bad guys masquerading as good guys, as I would call them. Meanwhile, us over here have been almost like a band of rebels. We've been led by people like you with the credentials and with the science, but for the most part, it's been a citizen scientist kind of approach. You've had these, whatever you want to call them, influencers, the N of one people that have reversed their ill health and get themselves back to vitality. The plural of anecdote is data kind of army. But there seems to be a little bit of a cultural shift now. And I'm curious, you've been in this for such a long time, how you feel about this whole temperature check on, the band of rebels finally getting some airtime that maybe they deserve. How do you currently feel about the momentum right now that health seems to be experiencing?
Well, I just want to say that although it's less well known, there are many, many serious scientists working on clinical trials, biomedical research, that have established now, if you go on the government database for scientific studies and you put in low carb and ketogenic, thousands and thousands of hits come up. I think the only diet that's been more studied, and not by a lot, is the Mediterranean diet. That means there is serious scientific work that has gone on. Much of that work is in clinical trials, which are, high level, rigorous quality evidence. So there's been a lot of scientific work that has gone on that provides an underpinning for the N=1 citizens movement that we're also experiencing. Both have gone on. And I think in the US right now, we're at a very optimistic, I have a lot of optimism for the moment that we're in. There's energy for change. Robert F. Kennedy and the people around him who created this Make America Healthy Again movement, the MAHA movement, have done an almost miraculous job of elevating this issue from nowhere to really being top of mind on the national agenda. And I think there's a huge opportunity to create real change right now. I know that any political movement has a variety of actors. Some of them are high-minded and want nothing but the public good, and others have other agendas. But I think there's at least a chance of creating true lasting change in this field. The reason I think it's so important to create top-down change from the guidelines, I've discussed this quite a lot with people who think the guidelines, who pays attention to them, nobody follows them. But the reality is that these guidelines, and I think also in the UK, your Eat Well plate, they really are considered the gold standard. They're downloaded by all healthcare practitioners. When you go to your doctor, dietitian, nurse, nutritionist, they've all got the guidelines is what they're taught and what they then tell you. It's what the food in hospitals is based on, school lunches. It's taught in K through 12 education. So it really is, it's disseminated, even though people themselves don't realize where it comes from. The conception of a healthy diet and the food that is fed to people in any public program, which is 1 in 4 Americans every week, comes from the guidelines, right? The idea of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meat, low-fat dairy, that's the guidelines. And it's all federal programs are required by law to follow them. So I think that really has to change, and it has to be, and to counter the folks who say, why don't we just abolish the guidelines, which truly didn't seem like a terrible idea to me, even though it's probably very politically infeasible. But I think there's an argument to be made that now, after 60 years of misinformation, we need to have a senior authority like the government embarking on a huge educational campaign to re-educate Americans about what is a healthy diet and what is the diet that they can use to effectively reverse chronic disease in an evidence-based way. So there's just a huge re-education need. And so that alone is a reason I think we just need to continue along this path and reform it as the next steps.
Yeah, very well said. And I know you're actively trying to get involved in this in more of a way than just being, writing more books and being public health advocate and spreading this information, but hopefully getting your fingers dirty and actually doing some of this work. What would you like to see happen at the level of the dietary guidelines? Like, if you could wave a magic wand, what would be the big rocks that you're looking to stack and really change?
I think so. There's a number of things to do. There's a huge problem with transparency that was identified by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and is really apparent to anybody with their own naked eyes. I mean, we did the only systematic review ever of a dietary guideline advisory committee looking at their conflicts of interest. We found that 95% of this 20-person committee had a tie with food or pharma. Half the committee had 30 such ties or more. One member of the committee had 152 ties. So And none of those conflicts of interest are disclosed. Whereas in most guideline committees, there's at least disclosure. The National Academies said you can have some conflicts on the committee. Ideally, you don't want more than half the committee with any conflicts, but you need to manage them, which, just to give you an example, like have an animal proteins specialist, and then you can also have your plant protein specialist. But you have to, if you're going to study protein, you have to balance them. It is a little unrealistic to say that we're going to have no scientists with any conflicts of interest, because that pretty much wipes out anybody in nutrition science. They all receive money from industry. That's just the unfortunate truth. So that's one plank that really needs reform. I think the other one is that currently the guidelines do not use any recognized methodology. There's a paper that's just come out that shows that they tried to replicate the scientific reviews in the dietary guidelines. I believe 8 of them failed to replicate, said that the reviews were of critically low quality.
Wow.
These are the reviews that are conducted by USDA itself, U.S. Department of Agriculture. The National Academy of Studies said that the scientific reviews lacked rigor, did not use, that they needed to be more rigorous in order for the guidelines to be trustworthy. That National Academies made 11 recommendations on how to do that to USDA. None of them were fully adopted. So in effect, we have a process that does not produce trustworthy guidelines, and that absolutely needs to change. As a start, we need evidence-based guidelines that we can trust. So, and if you go down that route of holding the guidelines to high evidentiary standards, you will end up with a better set of guidelines. I mean, I could speculate about where I think they would go and where I think the evidence lies, but ultimately it will be expert scientists whom you convene, who bring together, and they look at the evidence and decide these issues. Like, should we be recommending 6 servings of grains every day to all people, including 3 servings of refined grains? Why do we do that? 10% of calories is sugar. Why do we do that? 10% cap on saturated fats and replace that with seed oils. When 22, 23 systematic reviews now have said that saturated fats have no effect on cardiovascular or total mortality and little to no effect on heart disease, why do we still have those caps when the overwhelming scientific opinion worldwide, all these studies show that that is not supported by the evidence? So, the cap on sodium has been demonstrated to perhaps be effective for hypertension for middle-aged adults with diets high in sodium. Why are we applying that to children in schools? That just makes their food tasteless. I mean, I think there's just a number of issues we could get through that would dramatically improve the guidelines. And another really important issue, which is true in the US and the UK, where you are now, there's no option for people with metabolic diseases. So in the US, that's anywhere between, say, 60% or 93% of the population have some kind of metabolic dysfunction or disease for which they're taking medication and have symptoms. The guidelines do not address those people.
Right.
In 2020, they didn't even review the evidence on how to lose weight. Nothing on obesity. Their guidelines are only for prevention. That is to say, before you get diagnosed with anything, they believe their diet can prevent disease, which it actually is also not true. But they have not reviewed the science to look at reversal. How do you reverse type 2 diabetes? How do you reverse hypertension? How do you reverse heart disease? They don't look at that science, so they really are not addressing the majority of people in the country, even though they are universally applied to the public. So that's another huge problem that I think needs to be fixed.
Yeah, it seems like it's a bit of a mess, but I agree that if you could get well-intentioned people to sit around a table and limit the conflicts of interest as much as possible in something like this, then you would at least be able to reach some sensible middle ground. I believe that any respectable, free-thinking, well-intentioned individual will at least agree, hey, let's start to figure out ways we can limit ultra-processed foods, or at least, make those healthier. Like on the limiting or improving the quality of ultra processed foods in particular. One of the interesting things that I like to do now, and this has become a popular talking point more recently with the comparison of foods in the US to foods in the EU, for example. So I've been going around the supermarkets here whilst I'm in England. I'm in Tesco, and I'll look at things that I know we have in the US and compare them to things that we have here. And you see a very different ingredient list. Sometimes 25% less, 50% less ingredients, less of those things. And I think these are at least some of the low-hanging fruit things that we can agree on as people and hopefully as a scientific community, that that's not helping anybody. And, voices like RFK fixing those and eliminating those is probably going to be a very, very positive thing. However, I do worry, and I'm not going to be the scientist around the table, but I will be an interesting observer of all of this. I do worry, and I'm interested to see how it plays out when people that have more of this ancestral lens, that saturated fat isn't the devil that it's been painted to be, versus the people that are limit saturated fat at any cost, and saturated fat raises cholesterol, and cholesterol leads to cardiovascular disease, and that's our biggest killer, so we must do this. It's going to be very interesting to see if we can reach some kind of middle ground there, or whether ideologies are too strong. What's your take there? Do you think we'll ever see a time where, the USDA or the FDA or whoever it is walks back and says, yeah, maybe we did get it wrong on saturated fat? Or do you think that's a hill they're going to die on forever?
Well, I think for saturated fat, that definitely would fall under the purview of USDA and these new dietary guidelines. And if I have the privilege of being involved, I think we will definitely address that. I think for seed oils, probably the way to go on those is to reevaluate what's called their GRAS status, which is generally recognized as safe, as a status that's given to new ingredients in the food supply. And I don't know if seed oils were ever really given GRAS status in the form that we're eating them now. I know that trans fats were given GRAS status, but I think they need to be reevaluated. I don't think they've ever really been critically evaluated based on all the evidence that we now know about them. So I think they should, potentially we should not be using seed oils in our food supply. Certainly not in heating and frying and applications that involve heat or, exposure over long periods of time to light.
That's one of the fascinating things I've seen from some of the pro seed oil crowd recently that kind of makes my head spin, is they'll say something along the lines of, seed oils are fine until you heat them and eat them. And it's kind of like saying, well, cigarettes are harmless until you smoke them, right? But that's kind of why they exist and what they're used for. And therein lies the problem, I guess. A native sunflower oil that still preserves some of its vitamin E in a cold press form is much different to one that's thrown in a pan and baked a few times at 450 degrees. But wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we could wave a magic wand and get those off the shelves and see what would happen to health in the absence of that? Because I'm not the scientist here, but I have a strong spidey sense feeling that would just change the landscape of chronic disease quite impactfully, quite rapidly as well.
Yeah. I do think that first of all, I would push back a tiny bit on what you said about like non-heated and heated. Like you can use them, say, in salad dressings or in mayonnaise, or that's not heated, but the chemical reactions that cause oxidation and perioxidation products that are some of these are known toxins like aldehydes and acrolein and formaldehyde. Those, that only happens when they're heated. So they definitely get worse when they're heated. They degrade. And so there is, which is not to say they're great for you when they're unheated either. But yes, I definitely think that there would be a lot of, I believe we could see health benefits from taking them out of the food supply, particularly with respect to heart disease and cancer, is my reading of the evidence. I know that among people who are really focused on seed oils, they tend not to think that sugars and starches are as bad for you. But I will say that where the clinical trial research is strongest, that's the highest quality research, that really shows that reducing total carbohydrates, sugars, and starches is the most highly effective way to reverse out of a number of chronic diseases, including type 2 diabetes
Yeah.
and hypertension, heart disease, and emerging evidence for mental health conditions, polycystic ovarian syndrome, fatty liver disease. And in some of those trials, they allow people to keep consuming seed oils and still see results.
Mm.
So that's not a push for seed oils, but I'm just saying the evidence is somewhat equivocal on some health outcomes.
Yeah.
So we just have to be wary. I mean, we have to go through a proper process of evaluating oils before crusading for their elimination. We
Yeah.
have to be sure that we know which conditions they are really have an effect on, and for which there's strong evidence, and not go too far along with weak evidence. It's not that it's the way I feel about weak evidence is it has gotten us into the terrible, it's gotten into the disastrous situation that we exist in today, which was when we formed the dietary guidelines in 1980 based on weak evidence. And
Right.
people made the arguments, the same arguments that we hear today. But we just have to get rid of, we have to change things because we are reasonably sure these are bad for disease. We are reasonably sure saturated fat and cholesterol are terrible for us. We have to act now. We can't wait for more evidence. The public health depends on it. We must do something. And we ended up doing the wrong thing with unintended consequences that we're still suffering from today. And now we hear the same cry about not just seed oils, but a number of different elements in the food supply, saying we can't wait. Doesn't matter that the evidence isn't in yet. We can't imagine the negative consequences. We have the same passion to help and to want to create change, but we do have to be disciplined in the way we go about it, because once you implement population-wide guidelines, they are demonstrably really, really hard to change. So we just have to be careful.
It's very wise. I like that approach. From somebody that probably would have every right to be the person that's trying to wave the wand and say, get these out, the poisonous, but taking a very nuanced and truly scientific approach. It reminds me of the Stoic frame. Marcus Aurelius said, the best revenge is to be nothing like them. So don't use the same razor that they fight by, which is crappy science, even if we think there's a smoking gun here, which I know we both do, but let's do our due diligence. And it's kind of like the censorship of speech thing, right? If you don't like speech, the way to battle it is with better speech, not to just eradicate it and move on.
Right.
And I really appreciate that. And that's obviously from somebody that spent a lot of time in this game and a lot of time thinking about this. And I just really love your insights and your perspective.
Thank you.
So what I would love to close with today is, we want to send people over to YouTube to watch the documentary Fed a Lie. And I'm just curious now, a couple of weeks removed from the premiere and the outrolling of that, what's your feeling about that documentary, and what do you hope comes in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, the legacy that you kind of leave as your role here as one of the pioneers of a hopefully healthier America?
Well, I think it's a great documentary and everybody should go watch it. The filmmakers did a fantastic job. And I think it hopefully will serve its purpose of educating people about this largely unknown yet vastly prevalent ingredient in our food supply. People need to learn more about it. And then what do I hope will happen from here? What we've already talked about. I really hope there's serious scientific scrutiny that will happen maybe for the first time in American history of these oils. It's time to take a serious look at them, not sweep the science under the rug, and see what comes out of a rigorous and objective scientific review. And hopefully that's what we can perhaps accomplish over the next 4 years.
Yes, let's do that. That sounds wonderful. Nina, where can people go to keep up with you? I see you on X these days. That's where I'm watching. Is that where you're the most vocal these days? Or is there anything else exciting coming up? Any other places you'd like to point people?
Yeah, I mean, I write a column on a platform called Substack. The column is called Unsettled Science. You can sign up for free. And I'm I'm most active on X at Big Fat Surprise.
Big fat
So that's
surprise.
where I respond to people, and that's where late at night, if you tweet to me, I'll probably tweet back to you. But otherwise, I don't do much on social media.
So what Nina's saying is, if you want to get in a fight with her, that's where you'll find her. Okay, and she's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
throwing no punches these days.
I try not to get into fights, but
Well, we
try to
love you,
stay
Nina.
nice. Talk
Yeah.
about taking the higher road.
Yes, yes. We will be in your corner and fighting the good fight as well. Nina Teicholz, ladies and gentlemen, you folks stay radical, and we'll see you next week. All right, friends, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Radical Health Radio. We got a fresh new podcast for you every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, consider liking, subscribing, reviewing, and rating us on your podcast platform. It helps to spread this message of radical health. We'll see you next week.